Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Iran's foreign ministry has rejected any new negotiations or changes to the participant of Tehran's nuclear deal with world powers. The statement came after French President Emmanuel Macron said any new talks should include Saudi Arabia. Macron's statement came after he had a phone conversation last week with US President Joe Biden. The two had discussed the Middle East and Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. The nuclear accord is a multilateral international agreement ratified by UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is non-negotiable, and parties to it are clear and unchangeable. That was what the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh said, and he was quoted by the Iranian media as saying this last Saturday. Iran began breaching the deal's limits on uranium enrichment activity after Washington withdrew from the pact in 2018 under then-President Donald Trump and reimposed economic sanctions on Tehran. President Biden's new administration has said it will rejoin the deal, but only after Tehran resumes full compliance with its terms. Iran has rejected this demand and says it will go back to the original deal after Washington lifts sanctions on Tehran. Saudi Arabia and its ally, the United Arab Emirates, have said that Gulf Arab states should be involved this time in any talks, which they say should also address Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for proxies around the Middle East. This demand reflects former US President Donald Trump's policy of maximum pressure campaign against Tehran, which Riyadh supported. This is also the line taken by Israel. To discuss this further, I am joined by George Szamuely, Senior Research Fellow, Global Policy Institute, and author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. With him, I have Hamedreza Golemzadeh, a Tehran-based freelance journalist and cyber activist, and Calvin Dark, a political commentator and co-founder of RC Communications based in Washington, D.C. So thank you to the panelists. Let me begin with George Szamuely here. George, we had discussed this earlier also, this whole issue of sequencing. Now, clearly, this is going to be the bone of contention, but added to it now is, of course, what Macron has said and which I talked about. And the details are that he was cited as saying this by Al Arabiya television last Friday. And he stressed the need, and this is Macron, to avoid what he called the mistake of excluding other countries in the region when the 2015 deal was negotiated and should include Saudi Arabia. So give me your initial thoughts on this, and then we can get into specifics.
As we had discussed, I think the last time I was on the show, the Biden administration is in no rush to rejoin the JCPOA. Secretary of State Blinken's remarks at his press conference last week indicate that the first steps have to be taken by Iran. That Iran has to come into compliance with the JCPOA. Then the United States will assess whether Iran is in full compliance with the JCPOA, and then the United States might return to the JCPOA, but with a view to renegotiating the agreement such that all sorts of other issues are introduced, such as Iran's ballistic missile program, such as Iran's regional activities. Now, such a thinking really isn't on, because Iran quite rightly says that we didn't break the agreement, we didn't walk away from the agreement, you did. The United States walked away from it. The United States walked away from it in 2018. The United States reimposed the sanctions, the very sanctions that this agreement was supposed to eliminate. And now you're saying that we have to make the first step, and then you come back and try to come up with another agreement, a much less advantageous agreement for us, the Iranians, by introducing all sorts of other issues that affect Iran in a fundamentally existential way. And Iran's saying, no, we're not going to do it. Since you're the one who walked away from the agreement, you're the one who has to make the first step to come back into compliance with the agreement. Then maybe we can talk about other things. But the Biden administration's negotiating position is untenable.
Right. That's something that one has to agree with. Calvin Dark, the problem with this is, bringing in other parties, is that this particular deal is with reference to Resolution 2231 of the United Nations Security Council. So if we say, well, new parties can be brought in, then that cannot be under this resolution. It has to be a different resolution. And then that would mean opening the text and going through excruciating negotiation process once again. And one assumes that during that process, Iran would remain under sanctions. So what exactly is there for Iran in this?
Well, I think that there is the possibility of coming to a new agreement or an enhanced agreement where the sanctions will be lifted. But I think that one of the things that Iran has to keep in mind, as you know, they've staked out a pretty firm negotiating position because they're counting on U.S. credibility having been decreased under the Trump administration when it comes to our international agreements, which is true. But when it comes to the Iran deal, here's the problem. For true or not, Donald Trump successfully conveyed to about half of this country that how bad the Iran deal was and how much of a better position we're in as far as our safety goes to not be in it. So it's like Iran is trying to negotiate thinking that Biden has to get back into the deal and they just want the best terms. No, Biden's got to sell it to the U.S. Congress and people that we even need to get back in it. So yes, a new text would have to be developed. It would include things that weren't in the former agreement because once again, Biden has to make the case that we need the Iran deal because we've had a president before him that said it wasn't helping us. In fact, it was hurting us and our allies such as Israel.
That's an interesting point and reflects more the domestic pressure. We'll park it and we'll get back to it. But let me pull in Hamedreza Golemzadeh here. Hamedreza, Iran is, at least on the surface, playing tough. But we also know that Iran is hoping for some kind of breakthrough because the sanctions are really hurting. So what exactly is the play here for Iran?
For Iran, the point is that for years, Iran has been committed to the JCPOA without benefiting from that. And we know that from the day one, Iran actually get into the negotiations because it was hopeful that it can remove sanctions and have some economic improvements and enjoy from that economically. For Iran, it was never an issue of a nuclear bomb and preventing a nuclear bomb in Iran and such things because Iran never followed that agenda. For Iran, it was just economic improvements, which has not happened at all. Neither during President Obama, who signed the deal himself and did not allow banking transactions to get normal, and neither during Trump, who actually withdrew from the deal. So the point here is, and particularly regarding the law ratified in the parliament, was that if Iran is supposed to stay in the deal, and the other parties are supposed to enjoy the limitations and inspections that the JCPOA has entitled them with, so they should pay the price, or at least Iran needs also to benefit from that as well. So either this pressure and the deadline that the parliament has set would lead to removal of sanctions so that Iran can sell oil, can have banking transactions and such things, or it would stop implementing the deal and it would stop additional protocol which has been voluntarily implemented in Iran, and then there would be some balance in the deal between the two sides, Iranian side and the other sides. So it is not it's not something just slogans or something for bargaining and such things. Iran says that there is no other way. I would continue accepting the limitations without benefiting from that. So that's the deadline. So by February 24th, if these sanctions are not removed and lifted completely, all the sanctions considered within the JCPOA, all the sanctions that President Trump imposed or reimposed or relabeled during his administration, if all these things are not removed and Iran is not able to sell its oil or trade with other countries just like a normal country, then there would be no additional protocol at place. So that's the message that Iran is sending. And for Iran, the deal is still in place. So there is no further negotiations, and when there is no further talks, there is no new agreement, and when there is no new agreement, there is no need for new players and actors and parties to the negotiation. So the deal is still in place. And as you just mentioned, if there is going to be a new party, there is going to be new resolution. The new resolution needs new discussions and new negotiations, and it's a loop which have no end. Okay, now you're adding, for example, the countries in the region. Then you can add, for example, G7. You can add G20. You can add ASEAN. You can add.
Precisely, I get the thrust of your argument. Let me get back to George Szamuely. George, the interesting thing here is that Joe Biden is now using Macron's shoulder to fire this shot. And Israel is using the Saudi UAE shoulders to fire this shot about having other parties as part of the deal. It seems to me that even if, and that in and of itself is a big if, even if Iran were to agree to, look into its ballistic missile program, or perhaps its realpolitik in the Middle East, it is still very unlikely that it would want a deal that would clearly be dictated by its rivals in the Middle East.
That's an excellent point. And there's a couple of issues involved here. I mean, you can't have a new agreement when you have failed to implement the last agreement. I mean, the United States clearly failed to implement the agreement by walking away from it for no reason whatsoever. So you can't then come back and say, well, we want a new agreement and introduce all sorts of other issues into it. I mean, then we'll say, well, we'll have to sign yet a second agreement, and then the next man in, because there's a good chance that Biden could well be just a one-term president. The next man in walks away from it, and then what? Then we're going to have a third agreement? So there's that one thing. The other thing is that attempting to address Iran's ballistic missile program, as well as Iran's support for Syria, Iran's support for Hezbollah, those are issues that go to the very core of Iran's strategic concerns. I mean, Iran has a serious expectation that it will one day be involved in a war either with Israel or with the United States or both. Therefore, it needs its regional allies, and that means it needs its hinterland of support, which is what Israel calls the, quote, Shia crescent, unquote. But it means essentially it needs its regional allies. And therefore, Iran isn't just going to give them up. I mean, because then Iran makes a serious step towards weakening itself. So basically, what these issues that are being demanded of Iran are something Iran cannot give up. And so if Iran has to think, do we have another denuclearization agreement, or do we give up our support for our regional allies? They're going to say, we would rather just go without a new denuclearization agreement because supporting our regional allies is much more important to us.
Right. Quickly, give me your analysis of what Calvin Dark said about the domestic political compulsion. He talked about essentially the divide down the middle. And the fact that Donald Trump successfully sold this position to people who voted for him, and there are lots of those. So perhaps Biden's hands would be tied because of that. Is that an argument that reverberates with you?
Biden's hands are certainly tied. As for, of course, Obama's hands. I mean, remember, Obama did not seek a ratification of the JCPOA because he knew he didn't have the votes in the Senate. And I think that's a very good reason why Biden probably is going to make very little effort in order to return to the JCPOA, because it's just giving him political headaches. He will be under enormous attack, not just from the right, but from people within his own party. Remember, the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, was a strong opponent of the JCPOA back in 2015. So Biden doesn't really need the headaches. I mean, he's got enough problems on his plate as it is.
Right. Calvin Dark, the issue, as George Szamuely pointed out, is that you can't say, well, this deal didn't work, so let's go for another deal. Now, if we look at it logically, it seems to me, and as I said that, he's using Macron's shoulder to fire the shot, so it seems to me that Biden is in no great hurry for various reasons. And this thing is going to continue on the trajectory that it has been going. And possibly also because the paradox in having very stringent primary and secondary sanctions is that you simply cannot bring in more. You've already got a state in a vice-like grip, and there's not much more that you can do. So Iran perhaps would say, okay, we'll bide our time, and they'll continue to erode the other salient features of the deal. So give me your sense of how that scenario is likely to unfold.
I think, yes, it's very important. We talked about if there's going to be a new deal, what if we have a new president, if there will be a new deal with that president. And, I think those are very real concerns about what are Iran's motivations for even wanting to enter into a new deal when those, parts of this deal could change as far as their obligations go. And I don't think that, it's a really fair process, but it is a realistic process because we have a system in this country where it could change in 4 years, could change in less than that, depending on our midterm elections. So I think that what one of the other co-panelists said about Iran having to really make that calculation of whether or not their priorities of supporting their allies in the region and some of their other geostrategic goals might be more important than re-entering the JCPOA or a new agreement based on it. And I think that's it's a very real politic because it acknowledges the very real dynamics that we're facing here in the U.S., but that Iran has to recognize that it has to accept if it were to enter negotiations for a new deal.
Right. Thank you. That was Calvin Dark speaking with us. Before I go back to Hamedreza Golemzadeh, Macron also used the word strict, said any new talks on the nuclear deal with Iran would be very strict, and that a very short time remained to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Now, this is an interesting statement. Khatibzadeh said that Macron should show self-restraint. And he also said if French officials are worried about their huge arms sales to Persian Gulf Arab states, they better reconsider their policies. Now, it seems to me, Hamedreza, that this thing is not going anywhere and anytime soon. So here's the possible scenario that, Iran will keep eroding, as I said, the other features of the deal. Iran will say, okay, we are, and Iran has been doing this openly and saying that we are doing this because of the fact that, we've been placed under sanction. And that's it. I mean, so the issue is how long can Iran actually stay under these sanctions and allow its economy to suffer and the people to suffer? Is that the kind of punishment that Iran can take or is prepared to take?
We have been under sanctions for more than 40 years, for decades. And we know that.
But this sanctions regime is extremely tough.
Yeah, of course it is tough, and it is damaging the economy and the people. But let's remember that the former administration, it was Secretary Mnuchin and some other guys who admitted that the sanctions are over and there is nothing more to put sanctions on. So it is the end of the pressure that the Americans could put on the Iranian economy, and there is no real thing. And actually, for about 2 years, the sanctions that they were imposing were just theatrical, I can say. They were not effective or practical sanctions on the Iranian economy. For example, putting human rights sanctions on aluminum industry, which was already under sanctions. That doesn't make any change in the Iranian economy, actually. So what was happening was that they were actually trying to put more psychological warfare and pressure on Iranians. But now the Iranian economy and Iranian people have realized that. I want to remind you that when after about 6 months after withdrawal from the JCPOA, President Trump imposed the toughest sanctions, quote unquote, as he said. But the Iranian market did no reaction to that. It didn't change anything in the Iranian market. So that's the reaction that Iran is feeling about that. And I'm not talking about the Iranian government. It's about Iranian market and economy, which is mainly by private sector. So there is no further pressure to Iran. So here is the position for Iran, that I have survived so far, and I have learned how to deal with the sanctions, and I'm opening new frontiers and new opportunities for myself. So, for example, the club of sanctioned countries, like the deal that Iran made with the Venezuela, selling fuel and gasoline to them and trading with them, is an opportunity which helps both countries under sanctions. Right. Trading with, for example, Syria, Russia, Iraq, and any other countries who are under sanctions has given the countries an opportunity to work together and actually circumvent the sanctions. It's a result of the excessive use of that coercive measure that the Americans took. And because of that, it has actually, let's say, backfired. And Iranians now are going to move ahead. And from now on, even if the sanctions are not lifted, even if the deal is actually dead, the nuclear deal is dead, Iran is going to improve its economy now on. And it is just not something from inside the country. The World Bank has also predicted that Iran is going to get out of the recession and such things, and it's going to have growth in economy furthermore. So right. That's the situation here in Iran.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Hamedreza Golemzadeh speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go back to George Szamuely here. George, give me your 6 months to a year prognosis on this. My own sense is that this is not going anywhere.
As well, I think the Biden administration will just punt, play for time, but basically they're not going to go back in. There's no real political advantages to them. And I think Iran will continue with its policy of step-by-step walking away from the agreement. To be honest, I'd say the JCPOA is dead on arrival. It's just not going anywhere. It's a done deal. It's history.
Right. Thank you so much. George Szamuely speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss a statement by the UN Secretary General urging India and Pakistan to discuss their disputes. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on India and Pakistan to come together and seriously discuss their problems. He also said his good officers were always available for mediation. The Secretary General was addressing the first press conference of 2021. I do believe that it is absolutely essential to have a de-escalation of the situation, namely in the line of control. I think it's absolutely essential for the two countries to be able to come together and seriously discuss their problems. This is what he said, and this is a direct quote from what he said. To another question about India's human rights abuses in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir, the Secretary General said, and once again I quote, "I think it's essential that human rights are fully respected in all territories that you mentioned." He said he stood by a statement of August 8, 2019, which called for the resolution of the Kashmir dispute based on UN resolutions and the UN Charter. To discuss this further, I have with me Hassan, who's Senior Policy Specialist at the National Security Division. I also have with me Ali Sultan, an international law expert who also advises the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I should also be joined shortly by Ambassador Zamir Akram. But let me begin with Hassan Akbar here. Hassan Akbar, this is good news in the sense that, this whole sort of spiel about bilateralism, which obviously does not exist anymore after India's illegal annexation of Kashmir, that the UN Secretary General should more than once reaffirm the fact that his good officers are, there, and that the Kashmir dispute should be resolved under the UN's resolutions and the UN Charter.
Yes, Ijaz. I think it's a very positive development that the UN Secretary General once again is reiterating the disputed nature of the Kashmir territory, something that India has for several decades now tried to shy away from. It also reaffirms for Pakistan and for Kashmiris that the United Nations Security Council resolutions and the UN Charter is still applicable, despite whatever India may say or claim otherwise. I think it also highlights that Pakistan's diplomatic efforts to bring to international attention the issue of Kashmir, the human rights violations inside Kashmir, the constant escalation of and ceasefire violations on the line of control that India has been engaging in are now being talked about at the highest level. So at one part it shows success of Pakistan's dedicated campaign to raise the Kashmir issue at the United Nations and other multilateral forums. And secondly, it reiterates the international disputed nature of Jammu and Kashmir. So this is something which will be very difficult for India. Recently India has been elected to be a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, where it is trying constantly to make sure that the international nature of Kashmir does not come up in discussions, that India's position on Kashmir is accepted. But I think the world is waking up to this fact, and while some governments may not or may decide not to publicly raise the issue of Kashmir with India because of their economic ties with India and their diplomatic interests in the region, they will find it harder as time goes by to not raise the voice for the Kashmiri people. So, certainly this is a very positive development, and I think, we should see how this pans out in the future.
Right. Hassan, there's also another concern. I mean, yes, Secretary General said this, and as a matter of fact, he referred to his 8th August 2019 statement also. And so that means that, he's serious about this. But at the same time, he talked about the line of control. And you remember that the UN officers were shot at by the Indian occupation forces along the line of control. What exactly happened after that? Because to the best of my knowledge, I haven't really seen any clear condemnation of that incident by the UN Secretary General's office.
So, Ijaz, the incident report was submitted to the United Nations. The UNMOGIP, as you know, also does their own assessment of ceasefire violations regularly. In fact, they were on that visit on the line of control when that particular incident happened. But, the United Nations Military Observer Group has its own certain protocols which it follows. which is that it publicly does not submit its report or talk about ceasefire violations. As you know, for several decades now, they've been monitoring India's ceasefire violations regularly, but they don't give press statements or public statements. And so it is our understanding that the process happened internally and that report has been submitted. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why the United Nations Secretary General has, for the first time, highlighted escalation and violations of ceasefire violations on the line of control. As you know, in
that's an interesting point. Yeah, go on.
You see, that's a new development. The reason for that new development is that the internal process for the United Nations, where the report must have been submitted to the Secretary General, highlighting the constant, the fact that Indian forces threatened a clearly marked UN vehicle, which had not only UN markings, but also flew the UN flag on the line of control. It's a serious provocation. And I think that is the reason why this was included in the first press conference of the year.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Hassan Akbar speaking with us. As I said earlier, I am also now joined by Ambassador Zamir Akram, the former Foreign Service officer with long experience of working at the UN. So let me ask Ambassador Akram about what the UN Secretary General said in terms of India-Pakistan normalization, also the resolution of Kashmir under the UN resolutions and the UN Charter, and also de-escalation at the line of control. Ambassador Akram.
I think that this is a very important statement coming from the UN Secretary General. This, as you know, was his first press conference in 2021. And he was asked a question specifically about the situation in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And so, I mean, from the Pakistani point of view, of course, this is a very welcome statement by the Secretary General, because he highlighted, as you have mentioned, the UN Security Council resolutions as the basis for a solution of this dispute. He highlighted the human rights violations in Indian occupied Kashmir, and he also referred to the military exchanges between Indian and Pakistani troops along the line of control. As you mentioned, in the context, I'm sure, of the firing from the Indian side on UN vehicles on the Pakistani side of the line of control. So, in all, these are very important statements by the Secretary General, and I think he has also repeated what he has said earlier about his willingness to mediate or provide his good offices to find a solution to this issue. So I think, as I said, it's a very important statement from Pakistan's point of view, and we should try and build on this diplomatically within the UN and at the bilateral level, with particularly with the P5 countries.
Right. I'm going to return to you, Ambassador Akram, with reference to what you said about exploiting this diplomatically. But let me pull in Ali Sultan here. Ali, 2 or 3 developments: UN Secretary General's statement, reference to the line of control, de-escalation, of course, offering his good offices for mediation. So, what are the legal pluses here for Pakistan?
Well, thanks for having me first, apologize. Well, obviously, the first legal plus that one can find here is that the Secretary General has reiterated that the only resolution is going to be a peaceful one, and essentially he has called upon the parties to refrain from any acts of aggression or any military misadventure. Now, this is consistent with Pakistan's position, and it's a clear signal to the irrational, roguish regime of Narendra Modi to not engage in any military misadventure across the line of control, as they tried to do in Balakot. So that's the first positive that I can find. And then secondly, of course, it reinforces the international disputed nature of the Kashmir dispute. Again, something which India has been shying away from for decades. So this, again, cuts against their long-held argument. And the third positive would be related to UNMUGIR, because if you contextualize this statement with the remarks which the Secretary General made when he was in Islamabad a couple of months ago. He made it very clear to the Indians that the Indians should provide complete access and freedom of movement to Unmagib personnel so that they can carry out their mandate. Now, again, India's position for quite some time has been that Unmagib's mandate has lapsed. So again, this flies in the face of the Indian stance and buttresses our stance.
Right. Interesting point before I go back to Ambassador Akram. The fact that the UN Secretary General has talked about the Kashmir dispute, offered his good offices for mediation, and talked about the UN resolutions and the UN Charter, this roundly essentially rejects the India's revocation of Article 370 and India's illegal annexation of occupied Kashmir in what India has been referring to as an internal administrative measure. But Ambassador Akram, you talked about exploiting this diplomatically. Now, here's the issue. India is now in the Security Council as a non-permanent member. It's also increasingly getting very close to France and, of course, the US-India relations. So it's going to rely on at least these two countries to try and damage Pakistan. So give me a sense of what needs to be done in order to sort of, blunt that, and what else can be done to exploit these positive developments in favor of Pakistan.
Just two things that also we need to take into account. One is that the Secretary General indicated that this is a dispute between two nuclear-armed countries, and any clash between them would lead to unmitigated disaster, for which reason it is essential that there is only a political solution and there is no military solution. The other aspect of it is that it reinforces, as was mentioned, the legal aspect. So we need to hit on all these points. First, that it is an outstanding dispute which needs to be resolved in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions. Second, that this is a dispute between two nuclear-armed countries and the disasters that are implicit if a war breaks out between these countries, something that Pakistan has been saying continuously. And the third is that the legal position of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute remains unchanged as a dispute within and recognized as such by the head of the United Nations himself. So these are very important issues that we need to address and need to highlight. Obviously, first and foremost, within the UN Security Council, whenever an opportunity arises, and in the General Assembly, as well as in the other relevant bodies of the United Nations, such as the Human Rights Council, etc. One of the problems that operationally, in the sense, is that because of this COVID pandemic, these meetings are being held in online as such, and so that makes it extremely difficult to agitate this issue on a personal level. But I'm sure that in spite of these problems, our mission in New York and Geneva are capable of doing this. The other is, of course, through our bilateral relations. And as I mentioned with the P5, I think there's a new government in the United States. And even if the new Biden administration is keen on its relationship with the with India, it can certainly and has itself maintained a position criticizing India's human rights violations. So we should focus particularly on that aspect in our outreach to the UN, highlighting the fact that at least to start with, the human rights violations should come to an end, that the international community, including the media, needs to be given access to Indian-occupied Kashmir to monitor the situation, and, of course, reminding everyone that this is a highly dangerous situation, and that if they want to avoid any kind of regional instability that can escalate to a nuclear exchange, they need to address this issue sooner rather than later. So I think all these points need to be addressed and highlighted. The one point that I think the Indians will try to do, and they have already indicated that they will, is to shift the focus away from the human rights violations, away from the legal aspects of this issue towards this allegation of Pakistani-sponsored terrorism in occupied Kashmir.
Absolutely.
I think in that respect, Pakistan must make an effort to start distinguishing, asking the international community to start distinguishing between terrorism and a legitimate, genuine freedom struggle. In accordance with UN principles and the UN Charter itself.
And the UN resolutions also. Excellent point. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Zamir Akram speaking with me. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Ali Sultan. Ali Sultan, another issue which the ambassador has highlighted, and I think that's very important, that there's a nuclear dyad, and that India has clearly been, talking about short, sharp wars with Pakistan. They've actually aggressed in Balakot and so on. So give me a legal sense of how that is something that can be highlighted.
That would pure and simple be an act of aggression, which is prohibited squarely by the United Nations Charter, as well as many other international law instruments. So there is a clear prohibition on any such acts. And India cannot justify it as a preemptive action in self-defense, because that doctrine also does not enjoy any widespread recognition under accepted principles of international law. So there's really no way that any such aggressive actions by India can be justified under international law.
Right. Thank you. That was Ali Sultan speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.